a way of brief introduction, I'm Bethany Sanders. I'm a partner in the personal injury team at Leigh, and joined by my colleague Laura Murphy, who is an associate solicitor in the personal injury team. And both Laura and I specialise in representing clients who have suffered catastrophic brain injuries, with a particular specialism in brain injury, for which we both have accreditation with the Association of Personal Injury Lawyers. We're also very pleased to be joined today by Clare Chiwandire, who is a highly experienced and skilled occupational therapist, case manager and care and rehab expert. I'll leave Clare to tell you more about herself later on in the webinar when she is going to speak. So now over to Laura, who's going to talk through what we hope to achieve in today's session.
Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar. So I'm just going to outline some of the key points we're hoping to address today in today's webinar. Firstly, I wanted to be clear on what we're intending to focus on, which is that those who've suffered a brain injury and then either are parents or go on to be parents, rather than parenting a child who suffered a brain injury. And likewise, we could have done an entirely separate talk on addressing issues around Mental Capacity Act and whether someone has capacity to become a parent following a brain injury. As you all know, there's a huge spectrum for brain injury severity and recovery. So for today, for the purpose of today's session, we've decided to focus and narrow the discussion to those brain injury survivors who are able to resume or commence an active parenting role, rather than, unfortunately, those who are so impaired that they're not able to. We're going to set out what we consider to be the most frequently encountered challenges, just by way of summary, and Clare will then give some practical tools and advice to assist in overcoming these challenges and how those need to be adapted to adjust to the child's changing development with their age and their needs. I'm going to give a brief summary of how these challenges can be addressed within the legal claim. And then both Beth and Clare will set out some case studies which showcase how some of the theories we're going to discuss will be put into practice. And finally, we'll have some time for questions, as Beth has mentioned. Okay, next slide, please.
So we're just going to talk through some of the common problems that arise. Obviously, these are very subjective in terms of the individual's experience and how their injury affects them. And also it's important to consider what stage they are in their recovery and issues in terms of the family dynamic and the particular needs of the children involved. However, just by way of example of some of the typical issues that might arise, in terms of irritability, that's often reported as a problem. Many brain injured parents report they don't have the same patience they used to have, and a lower tolerance threshold or short fuse, and that becomes a real issue in parenting if they become irritated by small frustrations, such as a child being noisy or not listening, etc. Confidence and self-esteem can be problematic. A brain injured parent may lose their confidence in their abilities generally, and that also includes in their ability to parent. They may leave decision making to the other parent, or not want to be involved in situations where there's potential conflict, which, as we all know, is an inevitable part of parenting. Insight and awareness can be reduced. It may be unclear to the injured person the extent to which their injuries impact on the family around them. They may become egocentric and not actually fully appreciate how their actions or omissions are actually affecting the wider family. On the other end, they may well have a lot of awareness and actually experience guilt about what it is they're no longer able to do, for example. They may feel that they aren't able to take as much interest or as an active role in parenting because of their own emotional or physical problems that preclude them doing so. Also, as any parent will attest to, there are multiple demands on a parent, and after a brain injury, it may be difficult to actually have that balancing act and be able to undertake that juggling that's often required. So it can be difficult to cope with those competing demands, and frequently people say that after a brain injury it's very difficult for them to do that juggling act anymore. For example, multitasking with helping a child with homework whilst also trying to prepare the family meal. There are often lots of practical problems that are cited by those with brain injury or family members, and that can be from being unable to drive, unable to take part in family activities, or not being able to go on certain holidays, that kind of thing, or having hypersensitivity to noise, their memory issues being very difficult to manage, and also loss of sense of smell or taste, for example, and how that can impact on somebody's ability to parent. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Beth. So I'm going to just briefly outline how some of these issues can be addressed within the context of a legal claim, but obviously very aware that not everyone who has had a brain injury has a legal claim, and the availability of resources both by the NHS and local authority are likely to be limited. But I thought it'd be helpful to outline how we, in our role as solicitors, use a claim to access funds to help overcome some of the challenges that Beth has outlined. So it's always good to go back to basics and back to basic principles of a damages claim. And I've actually put the quote there, which is, the basic principle is to put the injured person back into the position that they would have been in but for the injury, insofar as money can do so. So that's something we always go back to. And as early as possible in the claim, we would look to try to obtain an interim payment for the client to facilitate any support they may require. In cases where liability, i.e. who's to blame for the injury or the accident, where it's not straightforward, this can be more challenging. Although a number of defendant insurers, particularly those signed up to the Serious Injury Guide, will consider early interim payments or funding rehabilitation where liability isn't yet formally resolved. And alongside that early intervention, we look to instruct a specialist case manager, and particularly one with brain injury experience, ideally with accreditations such as with Babacom. And the case manager will be really key to making recommendations to help support the injured person and their family, so that we know what's required and can get the funds to do so. As a claimant solicitor, as the claim goes on, it's really important not to take things at face value, and experience teaches us that the account given by a claimant or client may well differ to that of family members or treating professionals as a result of the client lacking awareness or insight, as Beth said. So one of the things we really have to do is collate evidence, including witness statements from family members and others, medical evidence, care expert evidence, to help show the true extent of the difficulties suffered. And it's really important to bear in mind that the burden of proof is on the claimant to actually prove the difficulties they are having. In particular, the spouse or partner's statement will be absolutely key evidence in demonstrating the difference in the parenting ability, both pre and post accident. Okay, next slide.
So I'm just going to run through very briefly a case study of a client that I represented after he sustained a moderate TBI in a cyclist versus car road traffic collision. Time constraints mean that this is only a very potted history of what was a very complex and involved case. Ben, who he's been named for these purposes, was in his mid-40s, and at the time of the collision had 3 children aged 14, 12 and 10. Over the course of the claim, actually was ongoing for 5 years, so they were all teenagers by the end. He was a director of a business and worked very long hours, but on weekends in particular, he would spend a lot of time with his family. He placed a lot of value on his role as a father and was extremely keen to be a good role model and to inspire his children, leading by example. He also placed a lot of self-worth and identity on his job role, so it was very important for him to resume that post-injury. It was evident from the very detailed statements that I obtained from him and his wife that he was a very hands-on and active parent and would find the time to help the children with their education and sporting pursuits before he was injured. He coached his son's rugby team and encouraged them to pursue various activities, often providing lifts to events and training. The term dad's taxi was used, which I'm sure many of us can relate to. Parents' taxi. Mum's taxi is just as utilised, I'm sure. He did his fair share of domestic tasks and contributed to the running of the family. Actually, when looking at the list of things that he would do pre-injury, it was quite hard to see where he found the time, but he was one of these people that just didn't sit still. Post-injury, Ben did make a very good recovery and was able to return to his previous job role. But his ongoing symptoms, although subtle in isolation, actually in combination had a very significant impact on him. He was fully independent in terms of ADLs and remained very high functioning, but fatigue was a particularly disabling symptom for him and meant that he struggled to do much else other than to work. His wife described Ben as working at the expense of his family life. And Ben felt that the two roles were now incompatible, and he put considerable pressure on himself in his return to work. Through the claim, interim payments were secured and a case manager was appointed, who worked in conjunction with a specialist OT to implement a number of recommendations to support Ben with managing his symptoms. Strategies were engaged to facilitate his working and parenting roles and to try and find a much needed balance between the two. Given the ages of the children, it wasn't so much hands-on care that he required that was required in terms of childcare, but it was much more about finding some practical solutions to these issues that the family experienced. So firstly, Ben being unable to drive added a lot of pressure onto his wife as she had to do all of the driving of the children to school. Actually, all three children were at different schools, which added to that difficulty, and also driving them to their various activities. So as a practical solution, a taxi account was used to replace some of those journeys that Ben would have done himself, and to also free up some time for his wife to do other things that Ben would have been doing. As Ben was unable to do as much around the house, given his depleted energy, a cleaner was hired for a few hours a week to help relieve the pressure on his wife, and that freed up Ben's time to focus on other things such as his rehab. It also helped reduce the tensions at home, as well as the feelings of inevitable resentment at Ben no longer being able to contribute as much as to the running of the home as he did before. Another way of freeing up Ben's limited time was to hire tutors to replace that additional education support at home that Ben had previously provided. As well as domestic chores, Ben had previously dealt with household admin, which following his injury became overwhelming on top of everything else. He engaged a PA to actually help him with these admin tasks and also to help with his diary management to support his return to work. As I said, the children were teenagers and would often argue and make noise. Ben was hypersensitive to noise generally and found that dealing with the noise and hustle and bustle of the household was very difficult for him. So a home office was built in the garden to give him somewhere to retreat to in order to get away from that noise and have a sanctuary. He often felt that he needed peace and quiet because he just couldn't tolerate the noise of the family home. And having that space when things were really overwhelming helped him to function. He even actually found the busyness of the house very overwhelming, and said that the a lot of the time at the home, it was visually overstimulating for him. So a company was hired to help declutter the house and remove that as a source of annoyance. Fatigue was such a significant issue for Ben, to the point where his wife said that he became obsessed with getting a good night's sleep. And if he was disturbed, he'd become angry and would find it very difficult to get back to sleep, leading to further irritability, reduced tolerance, and so the cycle would begin. And to try and combat that, there was work done on the house to help soundproof it and enable him to try and get better quality rest. Very much recognising that these are just some practical solutions and not by means the whole solution to the problem. So in tandem, Ben received significant therapeutic input, although he did find making time for that very difficult in his busy schedule. He worked on fatigue management and pacing with his OT, as well as investigating any potential causes of his fatigue with an endocrinologist. Crucially, he had neuropsychological support to assist with processing his difficulties and address his feelings associated with being unable to parent in the same way as he did before his injury. He felt extremely guilty at being unable to support his wife as much with the family life as he did before, and considered he was no longer the same role model to his children. And therefore we looked to try and support the wider family as well. That was key to try and help ameliorate the situation. His wife reported really missing the support that her husband would give her, and having somebody there to help make important decisions concerning their family, such as about their children's education, for example. She missed having support in disciplining the children. As I said, he would often retreat and not want to be involved when there was issues of conflict, and she often felt alone in parenting from that respect. Importantly, therapy was also engaged for his wife and children to help them deal with these differences in Ben following his injury and adjusting to the changes in family life as a result. There isn't a magic wand or a simple solution to a lot of these problems, but there were some kind of practical help that was provided via the claim. To conclude then, let's say a very potted history, but providing this support is critical to all claimants, but in particular with parents, they often have different needs that need to be considered as part of the claim. It's very important, as Laura said, to actually address the individual's personal circumstances in order to be able to fulfil the aim of compensation to put them back into the position that they would have been. It's also crucial to obtain evidence from other family members, again, as Laura mentioned. Many of the issues that Ben had were reported by his wife, and he perhaps wouldn't have recognised them himself. Yes, that often by virtue of their injury, an injured person might not necessarily know the impact that they're having on their family around them. As I said, obviously there is a limit to what money can do in these circumstances, as many difficulties are permanent, but I hope this case study goes some way to show and demonstrate how various methods of support can be used to help enable someone with a brain injury to engage as a parent, or to facilitate them to be as active a parent as they can be, despite the difficulties. So I'll now hand over to Clare Chiwandire, who's going to expand on many of these issues that we've touched upon from her professional perspective. Could you, next slide, please? I think it might be the one after that. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks to everyone for giving up their valuable time straight after a bank holiday weekend. And thanks for setting the scene, Bethany, and Laura. I'm an occupational therapist by background, and if we move to the next slide, I'm going to go tell you a little bit more about myself and run through the objectives for the day. I've been an OT for over 30 years. I've worked abroad, as you may have picked up by my subtle Australian accent. And I have worked in the UK for over 20 years. The last 13 of those have been as a case manager and doing expert work for the court in care and rehabilitation. My approach today is to recognise that we've got a lot of health professionals on the webinar today, and I'm going to try and look at a slightly different shift to the risks of parenting after a brain injury. So we're going to talk a little bit about parenting as a risky business, some ideas and thoughts about the assessment process and what to look for when you're doing a baseline assessment of the client and their family. I have a couple of case studies, a good one and a not so good one, because I think it's also important that we share the stories of when things don't go so well. And then I'm going to run through some of the strategies that I've used for supporting families, although there will be many, many more that those of you on the call will use yourselves. Next slide, thanks. Right, so I think many of us on the call will be parents ourselves, and parenting is one of the few activities that we assess as a therapist that is inherently one of the most risky. That is a personal photo. I'm not embarrassed to say that that is my daughter up a pole in a public event. And I think that indicates that we sometimes need to allow our children to take risks, and other times we don't. I'll share I won't share the consequences afterwards of that occurrence. So rather than the traditional approach of looking at risk and safeguarding, which often go hand in hand, I'd like to sort of almost encourage us to step back and think about more of the health and safety approach to risk. And I think when we're dealing with clients who've had a sustained brain injury, who have children of any age, there are going to be risks every single day. ROSPA, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents, there are something like 67,000 accidents a year for children in the kitchen, excuse me, about 58,000 on the stairs. Most accidents for children will occur in the home and outside the school environment. So that's inherent with part of our role as a parent. So I think when we're looking and doing our risk assessments, we need to assess those related to the client, but also stand back and look at those related to the child, but consider the probability that something will happen, the likelihood that something will happen, and what is the severity, what is the consequence severity. I'm also going to sort of explore risk avoidance and mitigation of risk, but also stepping back and looking at how we allow our clients to accept that there is an element of risk, and that involves us as case managers, therapists, health professionals, and less so solicitors, accepting that parenting is inherently a risky business. Okay, next slide, thanks. So a lot of the literature regarding parenting after a brain injury revolves around the client, identifying their impairments, and also looks at how to support children through neuroeducation. The common problems that we see as a case manager are the parents struggling with cognitive impairments particularly, and behavioural issues come into that as well. As Bethany and Laura said, we're not going to discuss today, in the interest of time, those clients that have severe physical injuries and that need a high degree of care themselves. We're focusing today's presentation on the client group we refer to as the walking, talking brain injured. Some of them will have capacity. That doesn't mean their decisions are always safe or wise. And some of those may lack capacity in relation to legal definitions to manage their finances or their litigation. But we are generally talking today about those that have ability to be involved in their health and wellbeing decisions without needing formal support with that. So parents will struggle with goal setting. The parent with a brain injury may also struggle with encouraging their children to develop their skills, emphasising boundaries, rules, structure and organisation is a massive challenge for the brain injured client themselves, let alone organising that and instructing their children. There tends to be less nurturing, it's one of the common problems brought up in the literature, and lower levels of active involvement with the children. The more obvious ones are depression, the client's loss of role, and their sense of identity as who they was as a parent. For the parent without the brain injury, the assuming that they're either co-parenting or married or in a relationship, we also find that they're less actively involved in parenting. And that's due to the time that they spend looking after the brain injured client or supporting them, whether that's practically, physically, or through prompting. We see a lot of parents without a brain injury struggling with their own fatigue, with stress, and with low mood. I'm sure most of us on this call will have come across clients whose relationship faltered and sometimes failed following a brain injury. And while it's difficult to pinpoint in this day and age how many relationships fail because of the brain injury, we know that it exacerbates the risk that that's going to happen. The children themselves, I think the screening process and the problems identified in the literature surround emotional and behavioural challenges that may emerge. And then there is the obvious, but hopefully less frequently encountered physical harm, that if a client doesn't parent with enough support, or there aren't the safeguards in place, that the child themselves are at risk of harm. Okay, next slide, thank you. So for me, assessment is everything. I think no stone should remain unturned, and you're not going to get all of this information the first time you see a client. I agree totally with Bethany and Laura and their suggestion that the spouse, the parent without the brain injury, they need to be actively involved in the assessment process. If the parents aren't together, but they share a child, I will get permission from the client, consent to speak to the other partner, because our duty as case managers and as health professionals expands beyond the client's needs. We do have a duty of care for the network that surrounds them, their family. Most of the health professionals and rehab practitioners will relate to the biopsychosocial model. I'm not going to go through that in depth today. But as a recap, we don't just look at their injuries and their impairments and the biological manifestations of the brain injury, but we need to examine their personality. Have there been any changes? We need to really drill down on their cognitive impairments, but also how those cognitive impairments impact on their day-to-day function. What's their emotional state like? How are they behaviourally? And it should be a standard question in assessments to ask about aggression, irritation, frustration. And I think it needs to be an overt question. All of these assessments rely on us asking and seeking out that information rather than relying on reports of the family. Socially, it's really important to look at the family, the immediate family, their ages, their genders, their developmental levels, you know, whether they're at school, whether they visit frequently, the wider family, are their grandparents, aunts, uncles, how supported is the client by their peers and their friends, obviously the work and socioeconomic factors. And we know that socioeconomic factors play a part in safeguarding children in its own right. So if you factor in a parent with brain injury on top of that, it's a really important thing to do. So I often use the 4 T's in my approach. And so when I'm assessing somebody, I think I would drill down into tasks. So know your client really well. Are they Are they gender specific? Are they traditional roles? What do they do? And I think Bethany just spoke in her case study about knowing, are they a father who sustained a brain injury, who before the accident worked a lot and perhaps only parented in the evenings, and on Saturdays would take their son to football or take their daughter to ballet? How much did they actually do? And what were the tasks, and what time in the day did that occur? That's how you're going to structure in your strategies. Time, I think it's important that that's quantified. That will absolutely help you to understand the burden of care that's then going to shift onto the parent without the brain injury. Thinking time, this is less documented in the literature. And by thinking time, I mean, how much did that parent do the planning, the organising, and the day-to-day decision-making? If it's a mum with a brain injury and she's potentially doing more of the childcare, and perhaps we will relate to that nightly checklist that you do as a parent of thinking, okay, I have to book a dental appointment for my child in the next month. I need a checkup. I need to replace their PE T-shirt. Those minor day-to-day things. What am I cooking for dinner? Have I got everything organised? That mental load is significant. And I think knowing who did that before, and if it is the brain injured parent that did a lot of planning, organising and day-to-day decision making, that needs to be factored in, because that is usually a huge challenge for the cognitively impaired brain injured client. The other lesser thought about part of parenting is talking. So the role of a parent in emotionally supporting their children, listening to how their day at school went, making the child feel loved, acknowledged, listened to, and as they get older, dealing with behavioural, dealing with their exploration of self, their identity, and the social identity in the wider world. That is a really important part of parenting. And I think that often as health practitioners, case managers, we focus on the instrumental activities of daily living, so the actual tasks, and we put less emphasis in assessing who makes the decision, who is doing the talking. So I just urge you all to think about those. Right, next slide. This framework is probably most familiar to people working in social care, and this comes from the framework of the assessment of children in need in their families. So as a case manager, I think we need to step outside the rehab model and the biopsychosocial model sometimes. This framework, I think, provides a really good checklist when we're looking at the children themselves, but it also helps us identify the areas that we need to check the client's capacity on. So if you look down the side of the triangle marked parenting, you'll see that the parenting roles include not just looking at the basic care of the children, food, shelter, etc. It includes monitoring and ensuring the child's safety. The parents' duties and responsibilities include emotional warmth, stimulation, guidance, boundaries, and stabilities. So part of our assessment needs to include their ability in those areas to undertake those. This is not something that's going to happen the first time you meet the family. It's going to happen over repeat and multiple sessions. And it's going to happen if your line of inquiry in your assessment is one of professional curiosity. The child's own developmental needs and their own welfare is addressed on the left-hand side of the triangle, and hopefully those will be familiar to most people. We're looking at their health needs, education, their emotional and behavioural development, their sense of identity. We're looking at nurturing family and social relationships, social presentation, and developing their own self-care skills. A friend of mine often says she's not raising children, she's raising adults, because that is a parent's end goal, that somewhere near the 18-year-old mark, you have an adult that you can trust to let fly in the world and that they will cope and manage. So I think that's a really helpful model to sit beside our rehabilitation model when we're dealing with parents who've had a brain injury. The family environmental factors are going to really shape your strategies. And I think knowing how they work is super, super important. Okay, next slide, thanks. This may be a refresher to some of you, but putting the context of the last slide, I don't think we can help parents who've had a brain injury unless we fully understand their parenting demands. As an expert, when we're asked to quantify parental care, you must have a knowledge base of childhood development. So what does a child need at certain stages? And if we look at this slide, you can see that in the early months post-birth, a child, we all know, a baby of that age cannot be left alone. However, there is a lot of sleep involved. So I think that has to be factored in. When they move into that 6 to 8 month and they're starting to wean, we have mealtime issues and feedings and solids, 8 to 18 months, they need that constant level of supervision when they're awake. And I'm not saying a baby doesn't either, but they are more sheltered in their little worlds. And so toddlers and walkers from 18 months to 3 years, that becomes significantly more physically demanding. The child's weight increases and their activity level increases. Carrying a 0 to 6 month old baby is less physically demanding than a 3-year-old toddler who's kicking and screaming and, weighs significantly more. And that impacts on our clients' tiredness level, not just their neurological fatigue. These children tend to, by this age, sleep about 11 hours a day, but during those waking hours, they are very intense. In that 3 to 5 years, and certainly in the toddlers and walkers as well, we talk about how long we can leave a child unsupervised. And generally, in the 3 to 5 and the toddlers to walkers, we're talking about very, very short amounts of time. You'll note that in that phase, a young child can usually be toilet trained and learn to dress and undress themselves with close supervision to make sure that they wear appropriate clothing when they exit. And there will be many of us that have seen their child go out in something that that we've had to change because that you can't wear your onesie to the supermarket or your princess dress somewhere else. And I think they can be left unsupervised only for very small amounts of time. And when we talk about safe environments, I'm talking about the scenario where the parent can leave their child playing in one room and move into the next one. So we're not talking about excluding school where they're under someone else's authority. We're not talking about long periods of time. And by safe, that would mean that any risky objects have been removed. Primary school age, we start to see it shift because parents have often got, with education itself, comes a time away from parenting, and nursery from 3.5 years is quite common. But with this age comes involvement in out of school activities. So that taxi of mum and dad starts to begin. Friends come home from school to visit and for play dates. And I think it has to be remembered when you've got a parent with brain injury that if their child's friend is being dropped off, does the friend's parent know that mum or dad has had a brain injury? Because they will often drop the child off and not stay. So, encouraging those discussions throughout those sort of toddler through to primary school age, we see a lot of that challenging behaviour. Teenagers, we'll get to that in a minute. But I think that this is where it comes to, going to bed on time or doing some chores, bring your plates in from the room, etc. And the verbal battles begin with parents. We're moving out of that toddler tantrum stage into the talking and listening. So it is quite time consuming. Teenagers, we know, should be largely self-caring, and I'll use that with a quotation mark. They should be more independent. We know, however, that their view on the world is different and is still being shaped and is still emerging. So the degree to which they voluntarily participate in those self-care and daily activities is down to individual circumstance, I think. Next slide. So Kidscape, a charity, looked at parenting demands and how much roles and how much freedom children were given. And I found it interesting to see that on average, British parents will let their child cross the local roads on their own from about the age of 9, roughly the age of 11, which is when they would be starting secondary school. They can use public transport independently, get the bus to and from school. From about the age of 12, most parents are starting, or the average parents is starting to let their children go out with a friend unsupervised by an adult, for example, to the cinema. And from about 15, we're starting to look at them going out up to the evening, saying, I'm going up, and we get that sort of really unstructured behaviour of, I don't know what time I'll be coming home, or I'm going to sleep over at someone's place. The practical support, feeding, dressing, toileting, bathing, lifting, all of those are very heavy earlier in life, but it's no surprise for us to sort of consider that the taxi services and that mental support of parenting reaches a different level as our children mature into the teenage years. Decision-making, emotional support, behavioural support, discipline, they're really key parts to a child's development, and those are the parts that often parents with a brain injury are struggling with themselves. So next slide. So we're going to step and put in a case study, excuse me, have a sip. In the middle of this, having set the scene, and this is the not so good story, and it's the scenario of when things can go wrong. So N is a client who sustained a brain injury at work. He had significant cognitive impairment, and he developed quite significant post-traumatic epilepsy after his brain injury. The rehab had been ongoing for about a year when his wife fell pregnant. It wasn't necessarily a planned one. She did not find out she was pregnant until into the second trimester. And a lot of steps were put in place. However, when the baby was around 6 months old, the client was with the baby, and I'll discuss that in a minute, and the baby sustained a severe injury. When the ambulance was called and the baby was assessed in hospital, the injuries identified were consistent with having been shaken. Sadly, the baby didn't survive. The baby died some 3 months later after life support was turned off. This is the kind of story that no one wants to face. This is a story that we all think about as the worst case scenario. And I think what was really interesting in this, as time evolved and investigations went, is that we had to identify the factors that may or may not have led to that. The wife wasn't working. However, additional support was given for private childcare. They had a 18-month-old child when the baby was born, who was 2 when the incident occurred. So private childcare was arranged so that mum could focus on the baby and also not keep an eye on the client themselves, the parent with the brain injury. A private support worker was also arranged for the client themselves to deal with their rehabilitation, to allow them to leave the house, do community activities, practice their sort of community skill building. Specialist treatment for the family and the children was provided regarding the epilepsy management, and that includes the usual safeguarding. So the baby needs to be on the floor when the nappies are changed, because Dad did want a role in looking after this child. He was a quite an amenable chap. He was self-caring himself. We were working on community and return to work goals, and he was actively involved in parenting. So the specialist epilepsy nurse went through with wife, the siblings, the dad, all of that epilepsy management. But there was an agreement in place that the client themselves wouldn't be solely responsible for the care of the baby. Unfortunately, the time that the accident happened, the mother had decided to leave the house and left dad in the care of the child for a few hours, which was unbeknownst to the treating professionals. Interestingly, in this situation, there was multi-agency contact. So adult social care had referrals for carers assessment for the wife. The children didn't meet a threshold for children and family assessment. There were no particular issues, and the wife didn't disclose all the issues at home, which came out after the event, which is where, when I talk back to that concept of professional curiosity, it becomes interesting. Unfortunately, there was a forensic history, police involvement with the father before his brain injury. None of the professionals were aware. The mother was screened and sort of directly asked about the situation at home, potential for direct domestic violence, behavioural issues. She was quite protective and guarded and looked after the client's sort of privacy in a way that had the worst case scenario. So I think putting that in context with our risk assessments, it almost seems that I'm talking in parallel when I'm talking about accepting that there are risks. However, we know that when things go wrong, they can go terribly wrong. In this situation, one of the key things was the interagency communication. We have to always remember that the police, the local authority and the health systems don't have single records. There was multi-agency communication between the primary care health physicians, between midwives, between schools, etc., but the dots never joined up. Okay, next slide. This is the good story. So after that little clanger, hopefully you can bear with me. So I really had the pleasure of working with a client who we're calling Jay. She sustained a hypoxic brain injury. She was scared of cows walking through the countryside, and when she was approached by a herd, she jumped through an electric fence, sustained cardiac failure, and there was delayed perfusion of about 40 minutes before the air ambulance arrived. A passerby was doing CPR, but she sustained a hypoxic brain injury. She had quite a severe amnesic syndrome. I'm talking in the region of 15 to 20 minutes. I could spend an hour with this lady and we would go through things, we would do practical tasks. By the time I got to the door at the end of the day when exiting the house, I'd say, well, good luck with the app we've just been through. And she would look at me and she would go, what's app? What app? I think the other thing is that she still couldn't remember my name after several years of working with her and multiple visits. She had a difficulty identifying faces and recognizing who people were. So she was delightful and she was pleasant, but she had a severe cognitive impairment. When I first started working with her, her children were around 11, 13 and 15. And her mother had moved into the house to help with her own support needs as well as parenting the grandchildren, so the client's children. The husband worked away. He often flew up to Scotland for 3 or 4 days at a time. And so while he was the most fabulous father, there's that time issue. He wasn't practical there. She also had a care package in place when mum wasn't at the home, when her family members left, and that was being phased in. But her own personal goals were to resume parental support for her children. She'd previously worked as a teaching assistant for quite so many years, and her life revolved around getting the children to school and then and then she would go to her job, and then she would have hours that were compatible with her being there as a parent from the minute the kids finished school. She really wanted to reduce the external support. While she loved her mother, she didn't want her mother living with her for life, and I can understand that, as we all could. And she also didn't want many paid carers coming into the home. So while we had the usual treating team in place, we had neuropsychologists, occupational therapists, we had taxi services, Headway were very involved. We tried a certain piece of technology. If you haven't come across it before, do give it a look. It's called Brain in Hand, and it was really instrumental in us being able to work with Jay. And once she habitually learned to check her phone, it carried a whole lot of micro cues and algorithms. So in the morning, it would bleep. It would remind her at 7:30 to check that the children were awake. But then it would give further reminders and algorithms to say, are they actually downstairs? Are they getting their things? At 15 minutes to 8, you need to call them down for their breakfast, and in the sideline, prepare their lunch. So slowly we worked task by task at a time. And by the time she was discharged, her case settled, and the family were doing so well that all external care had been withdrawn, because she had completely resumed the parental support, despite the underlying cognitive impairments and amnesic syndrome being fairly much unchanged from the day I started to work with her. And that's just a little quote from her. She didn't know what day it was, what she should be doing. And now with the assistive technology, she has a very structured, but it has planned and unplanned events, scenarios, and it's backed up by a 24-hour helpline if there's need for support with brain injury trained call handlers. So that's a good story, and it is unusual. The strategies that we had in place outside that I'm going to talk about further, but this didn't negate the need for taxi support. Her attending Headway to give her something to do when the kids were at school and continue to work on some meaningful roles. She was starting to volunteer at Headway, etc. And it doesn't diminish from the fact that they had family input from neuropsychology and, as I said, extensive therapy. Okay, so just another case story which takes a different tact, and I think it was allowing mum to take risks, but with a brain in hand that was a non-human support system that worked really well for her. Okay, next slide. I'm not going to go through this very quickly. I'm looking at the time, and I can talk very extensively. So your strategies for support, I think we need to address the client's needs, what strategies for the parent without the brain injury, and what strategies to support the children. The support we put in needs to be emotional support for their emotions at all levels, the client, the non-injured parent, and the children. Practical, I think we can do preventative and proactive strategies, as well as problem-based and solution-driven strategies that are bespoke to that particular family's needs. Next slide. So these hopefully are just a refresher of the many things you've all tried. Additional early years childcare, and I make that distinction. I would never get a support worker or a PA to help look after children if they were under 5 particularly, and I think you have to carefully assess that afterwards. So they need to be the Ofsted registered type of childcare supports if the non-injured parent can't do it and the client themselves is struggling. I think you can look at activity clubs outside of school, holiday camps, PGL, local community events. The obvious help was transport, taxi accounts, encouraging your client to look at carpools for the school run or friends and family. Explore any time and energy saving support mechanisms you can. The obvious domestic cleaning, gardening, getting in builders and tradespeople for home repairs, but also, ready-made meals, or those fresh boxes, or setting up the family to encouraging them to do online shopping so that they don't have to worry about that. That frees up the time for the non-injured parents to focus on sort of the more family, children, and their own and their partner's rehabilitation needs. Psychological support is a given. And I think there has to be an element of neuroeducative support by a neuropsychologist, as well as potentially counselling or play therapy if we start seeing, childhood behavioural difficulties or emotional difficulties, family therapy as well. Supporting the client themselves with parenting tasks. So using a support worker and using your MDT to facilitate that support worker standing on the client's side while they regain some skills for parenting, and doing that on a task-based approach. Look at assistive and energy-saving technology, brain in hand, other smart watches, smart devices, sorry. So some of my families have an Alexa or a Google Home Mini in every room, and they've set up a hub, and you can train them to, put the oven on at the time that they want to in case they forget. Use everything you can. Induction hobs, mains powered gas and safety alarms, any little bit of technology. My clients in general embrace that because it's less intrusive than needing human care. And for your professional types of support, I think as case managers, we need to reach out to and through the parents, but using their consent. But I think if there are high risks and behavioural things, you can reach out to both proactively support schools, but also share that information. Schools, the local authority, and you need to organise referrals to local services. Next slide. So here's some boring homework that you can read after the webinar has ended. Really important legislation at the start, which forms a background. I think everyone should know about Headway if they don't already. Carers Trust, I think your teenagers in particular, but even the younger ones from 8 to 12, I think they can often get support from the Carers Trust. Gingerbread is aimed at single parents, but I think the analogy of a parent who hasn't sustained an injury is that they often feel like a single parent. So there's really, really good resources on their website, community groups. I get families and I encourage them to look at websites, day out with the kids, to plan quality family time together, and to tap into education resources, books, literature. Jo Johnson's books are there. There are many others out there. Next slide. Questions. So I think that I'm going to welcome back Bethany and Laura at this stage. Thank you for listening. There was one question that we had come in.
Yeah.
Shall I address that in the first instance? So.
Yes, that question was, do you feel there are differences in supporting a client who has a brain injury once they are already a parent compared to how one might support a parent who chooses to have a child post-brain injury?
I think there are differences and similarities. So the scenario I gave in my case study, this was somebody that was planning, not planning, but we had the ability to plan that they would become a parent again, if you like, because they had one child. If they're planning to conceive a child, it gives you the benefit of the doubt, the benefit of time in preparation as a case manager. The strategies, I don't think differentiate from whether you're already a parent or planning to be a parent, but it does give you the foresight of planning.
And linked to that, there is a difficult line to tread between providing adequate support to clients with brain injuries who are parents and not overwhelming them and making them feel disempowered. Is this something you've come across, and how have you addressed it?
And I think my second case study really illustrates that point, that there was a lot of support in place initially, but the client didn't like the type of support and wanted to be empowered to do it herself. And it did take a lot of time to train her up with the assistive technology, but I agree, I am not someone that's risk averse. I do believe parenting is a risky business, and so we have to allow our clients to do it, and our job is to identify and minimize risks, but allow some inherent choice and risk. I think there's a danger, one of the biggest risks in case management is the danger of disengagement. And I think that if your client thinks, if I tell my case manager this, they're going to do a referral for safeguarding or adult social care, or they're going to curtail my freedom, then they will withdraw from the case management process, and that puts them and their children at even higher risk. So you have to have an honest conversation about, I can do this, I think we need to do this, but if you don't want that to happen, let's explore alternatives, and just document that it was an agreed risk.
I've had another question. Is the impact on family life greater if the mother is injured in your experience?
I don't know. I think it really varies. I think it depends on the parenting structure in the family. I think in terms of day-to-day tasks, if the mother is injured, it is very overwhelming for the children and the family lifestyle. However, it's sometimes when the father is injured, who was the perhaps the primary breadwinner and the disciplinarian, the knight in shining armor, I hear a lot of my clients' wives talk to them about. It's when they're injured that I see more family relationships fail. So, and I can't tell you why that is. That's just anecdotally from my experience. So I think it's equally damaging, but it damages families in different ways.
Yeah, as we said, it's obviously each family is very different in how they parent, and the division of labour between parents. So whilst there may be a more traditional role whereby it is the father who's the breadwinner and it's mum that does much more hands-on childcare, actually in a modern day that's just as likely to be the other way around, isn't it? So yeah, very much depends on the individual circumstances, and as you say, it's looking at what can be done from a bespoke perspective in terms of looking at what that family's needs are and what support they're going to require and what's going to work best for them. As you say, it might be that less intrusive methods like the assistive technology work better for some than others.
Lovely. Well, I think we're sort of coming to the end of our time now. So, and no, I can't see any other questions. So thank you ever so much. Firstly, to our guest speaker, Clare Chiwandire. I think your talk was really interesting and helpful, I'm sure, to those participating. And thank you all for attending and for your very interesting questions as well. This webinar has been recorded, so you should receive the link afterwards. So I hope that's helpful. And when we close this webinar, you will receive a short survey asking for your feedback, and also we'd be interested to hear if there are other topics that you would like us to cover in the future. So for now, thanks ever so much again, and take care, everyone.